Our Torah reading this Shabbat is Shoftim, the book that deals with how to create a balanced government in the future land, the promised land, the land of responsibility. I begin with an introduction to the Parsha, which is in our Eitz Chaim, and in the lower half, the comments are written by Rabbi Harold Kushner. This Parsha is devoted almost entirely to the theme of justice, from the obligations of judges to limitations on the power of kings. The well-being of society depends neither on the goodwill of the ruler nor on the ascendance of the most capable in a competitive environment, but on the certainty that the law will treat all alike and will protect the most vulnerable against the most powerful. The absolute primacy of justice, a theme that occurs throughout the Torah, receives its greatest emphasis here. It has been said by Heinrich Heine that since the time of Abraham, justice has spoken with a Hebrew accent. Our Parsha Shoftim, is a Parsha that prepares us for the new year, in which we are reminded that the ultimate source of right and wrong is God, Melech HaMelachim, the King of Kings. The notion of kingship is a little bit foreign, literally foreign to us who live in America. After all, that's why America was formed, in part, which was to overthrow the monarchy of England. And yet, to read our Torah reading is for me to be reminded of how even in a time in which kings were a given, there is great sublime wisdom for us to mine. And so our Torah reading begins, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha, judges and officers, judges and police, titen lecha b'chol sharecha, you shall place in all your gates, asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha, which the ever-present one, your God, gives to you, lishvatecha, according to your tribes, v'shavtu et ha'am mishpat tzedek, and you shall judge the people with judgments of righteousness. Lo tateh mishpat, do not lean any judgment. Lo takir panim, don't recognize faces. Lo tikach shochad, do not take any bribes, any gifts. And I love this next phrase. Ki hashochad ya'aver einei chachamim, for a gift, a bribe, blinds the eyes of the wise, visalef divrei tzadikim, and upsets the words of the righteous. And so tzedek, the next verse is a little bit more well known. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, righteousness, righteousness you shall pursue. Leman tichiyeh, so that you shall live. V'yarashta et haaretz, and inherit the land. Asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach, which the ever-present one gives to you. And the rabbis will talk, why is this tzedek repeated twice? Righteousness, righteousness, you shall pursue. First, let me go to the verb. Pursue is different than obtain. Pursue means that righteousness is ever to be before you as a goal, knowing that it's never a static situation, that redefining and reapplying justice in a society takes fresh eyes, takes a yearning for more. That tirdof, again, to read Torah sensitively is to know that words are purposeful. The verb is pursue. And then, why is the word tzedek repeated? Some say for emphasis, to know that this is a core teaching of Torah. Others to say that the means must also be just, not just the ends. Both the means toward tzedek and the goal of tzedek must be aligned. And there are many more explanations of why they're repeating, but that's not my focus this morning. My focus is the law of kings. Between two presidential conventions, it seemed like reading what the Torah had to say about the role of a king was relevant for this moment. And so I'm going to read chapter 17, verses 14 to 20, to describe the monarchy and share some classic comments. And then I will return to the opening line and show how that line is also understood psychologically as our own respective work. I want to point out before I read this law of kings that the role of king is in this context. Moses is preaching to the people. He will not enter the promised land with them. He's been the leader now for 40 years. And speaking on behalf or as the vehicle for God, Moses is describing the institutions that are essential for society to function. And the first is the judge. For as that introduction by Harold Kushner emphasized, that the underpinning of a healthy society is that the law is applied equally. Justice is pursued. It begins with judges and police, Shoftim v'Shotrim. It then goes to the king, and then from there we'll go to the prophet. For in the time of the Bible, the prophet had an important role as a check on the king. Remember the prophet Nathan, who will say to King David a parable about a powerful man who takes the only sheep from a poor man and says, "That's you," referring to King David having taken the wife of another man, and King David saying, "I have sinned." King David's greatness was admitting his mistake. And more, Elijah, the prophet, he will challenge King Ahab, whose wife Jezebel was a foreign wife who would pursue foreign gods. And he, the prophet Elijah, would flee for his life for challenging the king. So it's judges, the king, and prophets as the essential building blocks. And let's read now. What is the role and responsibilities of a king? If after you have entered the land the Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, and you decide, quote, "I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me," unquote, you shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set a king over yourself, one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses, since the Lord has warned you, quote, "You must not go back that way again," unquote. And the king shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall the king amass silver and gold to excess. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him, and let him read in it all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily toward his fellows, me'echav, his brethren, or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to that end, that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So just a few comments to bring to the foreground what was the concern and the limitations placed on the king. First, why was there a need for a king? Here in the introduction it says, it's your choice if you want a king, which is to say, you don't have to have a king like all the other nations. Quote, God says, you decide. When you say, I will set a king over me as do all the nations about me, you shall be free to set a king. But it's only much later, after the people enter the promised land, when they've been ruled for few generations without a king by judges and respective military generals, that the people will come to the prophet Samuel and they will say, place a king over us. We want a king like all the other nations. Abravanel was an important advisor to kings. He was an advisor on monetary matters to the kings Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain. And then when they were kicked out of Spain, he became an advisor to the king of Portugal. And then when he was kicked out of Portugal, he would retire or move to Italy, where he would write a commentary. And Abravanel would say, there are 3 reasons you need a king. You need a king to give you law, but the Torah is the law. You need a king to be able to apply the law, but the rules of the Torah also describe how a judiciary would be created hierarchically, and also in Parshat Shoftim is a description of the Sanhedrin, the higher court. And he said you need a king to go to war, but Israel had shown it could work with military leaders, so Israel didn't need a king. He said that Abravanel, again in the 15th, 16th century, with lack of respect for kings. But the people do choose a king. In the time of Samuel, and the first king will be King Saul, son of Kish, who had already proven himself as a military fighter. And the successor would be King David, who already as a young man would fight Goliath and would likewise prove military success. Because the key role of king in the ancient time was to be able to unite the military forces to protect the people. And so if you decide, here back to the text, that you want a king, okay, you can go ahead and appoint one. But it's actually me, God, and in that story of the prophet Samuel, it is God who will tell Samuel whom to appoint on behalf of God. In that regard, democracy, what we take for granted as the power of the people, was not known in the Bible, but there is so much wisdom here in terms of what's the nature of this role of authority. Do not set a foreigner over you would in some ways become the law of the United States as well. It's the one role in our Constitution that you must be native born to hold. Madeleine Albright could be Secretary of State, born in Czechoslovakia, representing the United States to other foreign leaders. But so that a person not born in America, or Henry Kissinger for that matter, but that's different than being the leader, the ruler. Moreover, verse 16, that king must not keep many horses, which was in the time of the Bible a source of wealth. You showed your wealth by how many horses you have. It's kind of like the yachts of our day. How big is your yacht? How many do you have? So, and the added thing, because horses were often identified as part of the wealth of Egypt in the Bible. Don't send anybody to Egypt to get me those horses. And verse 17, he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray. So to be distracted by many wives in Solomon's time were a way to create military alliances. Solomon had wives from Lebanon, from many other locations. And yet, as we saw with Solomon, he did go astray. And after Solomon, the united kingdom of Israel would fall apart, due in significant part to the heavy taxation that Solomon imposed on the people and his growing out of touch with the people. And last, and before I get to the concluding paragraph, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. And of course, there's a need to define terms. What is excess? But the key motif here is the king must serve the people, must not be distracted by the accumulation of those horses, too many wives, or too much gold and silver. A king's role is to serve, and that gets emphasized now in the next few sentences. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching, Mishneh HaTorah, which is where the word Deuteronomy comes from, by the way. Mishneh Torah is how the Septuagint would translate the Greek translation, the second Torah, and that Deuteronomy repeats many of the laws of the other four books. It's Moses' farewell. So this king needs to have a copy of, it's not clear, either the book of Deuteronomy, the teaching that Moses is now conveying, or the whole Bible, written for him by the Levitical priests, which is to say, the book that the king is to hold in his hand is not just his book. It's the book of all the people. If it's Deuteronomy or if it's all the book, it's the book that everybody knows. It's not like the king gets his own book of rules, of power, people may not know where my power is. Where the king's power is and what his duties are is to be exoteric, is to be both known by all, but more. As it continues, let it remain with him, and let him read it in all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching, as well as these laws. The king was accountable to God. That's where in England they would come with the Magna Carta, the image of a constitutional monarchy, that the king was accountable to the people through a shared set of laws. Here in the Torah, way ahead of its time, was the notion that it is God who is the giver of right and wrong. That's where that role of the prophets comes in. You see, the king is accountable to the moral dictates of God. And the Torah, which describes not only the moral dictates of God, though that's its core, but also the details of how law is to be implemented in all ways, both civilly and criminally. The king is accountable to those laws too. Thus, last verse, he will not act haughtily toward his me'echav, his brothers and sisters. In the commentary, in Eitz Chaim, there's two. There's one by Harold Kushner, which I began with, but the Pshat, which is the surface reading, is by Jeffrey Tegay, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. He comments regarding fellows, literally, quote, brothers. This underscores the essential equality of the king and the other citizens. The king is not their master. So I'll reread verse 20. Thus he will not act haughtily toward his fellows, or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. There are differences between the kingship here described and our own political system. Here, the role and responsibility of the king was hereditary. King's son Solomon by virtue of being his son, and by virtue of King David saying, of all my sons, it will be Solomon who will reign, would come into power. But at the same time, the description of the role of a king does inform what will unfold as democracy in stages from the constitutional monarchy post the creation of a constitution in England to what will unfold remarkably in the United States of America, which is the first real democracy as a nation created in the world, the first country in the world to give Jews the right to vote. A country established with a vision of equality, of the inherent right to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so now I turn away from the political description, and I hope that these words of our Torah are worthy of continued conversation around your lunch tables in terms of what does our Torah come to say about the role, the moral underpinning and responsibilities of a leader. To the opening, because again, I want to bring this back to us. The opening line. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sharecha. Judges and police you shall place in all your gates. Asher Adonai Elohecha, which the ever-present one your God, noten lecha lishvatecha, gives to you for your tribes. V'shavtu et ha'am mishpat tzedek, and you shall judge the people with righteous judgment. Torah is read on many levels. It's read in its own context. It's read pointing to the future as rights and wrongs that underpinning even changing political times as core values. And last, Torah can be read metaphorically as addressing us. And that is what the sages in the last few hundred years, and the Hasidic masters who psychologized Torah said, these are the words written in the month of Elul as we move to a new year. Judges and police you shall place in all your gates. What are your gates as a person? They are your ears and your mouth and your nostrils. They are those apertures that we bring in the world around us with our senses and more. Our gates are those parts of us to which we express ourselves into the larger world. Place on your gates, place before your tongue, in your ears, judges and police. Be vigilant as to what you're bringing in. First, what you're bringing in. We know that if you watch a movie like Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, I don't know if you've seen Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, but when I left that movie, I couldn't help but be paranoid that the birds were going to attack me. For images and ideas, when we bring them into ourselves, when we open the gates of our ears, they stay with us. They become the lenses with which our eyes see the world around us. Be careful as to the lenses, the confirmation biases that you place before your eyes. Because remember, it is justice and righteousness that are the goal, but more the rabbis emphasize. Place those judges and police on your gates, on the apertures that are your engagement with the world around you. Think twice before you speak. You may make mistakes. That's what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur come to acknowledge, that we fall short. And yet, Mishpat Tzedek, the pursuit of justice, of righteousness, is essential. And what we say to others matters. Most of the al-chaitz on Yom Kippur, when we pound on our chest, will be about callousness of the heart as if to awaken ourselves. But most of them will deal with the misuse of our tongue through gossip and scoffing and speaking hurtfully. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha. As we move now through Elul, we are cautioned as well that each of us is a judge, and we are all called to police ourselves as to how we engage with the world around us, by what information we take in and how we judge it as being information that leads us to justice. And we are cautioned how we use our words matter. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, on this, the Shabbat of Elul, the first Shabbat of Elul, as we move to a new year, we are reminded, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sharecha. Judges and police you shall place on all your gates. Let us vote. For who are our judges and who are our police is in this great country our responsibility. In the elections before us, let us accept our responsibilities. As citizens of this country, let us vote. And in our own lives, let us be vigilant that what we take in, which will form the lenses with which we see and hear and react, may we be careful that we take in truth, not lies. And may we, when we speak truth, knowing that there is right or wrong, there is falsehood. Yes, God demands distinction making. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sharecha. May we be worthy of the gifts God has given us, of freedom, of the ability of mind to know, and of the ability of hands and feet and eyes and ears to act. May we act righteously. Amen.